I stood on the front porch of the beautiful two-story brick house next door, keys gleaming in my hand, watching my son Michael's jaw drop as his friends and neighbors gathered around. The same neighbors who had witnessed him call me a freeloader just 3 months earlier were now staring in disbelief as I unlocked the door to my brand new home. The look on his face when I handed him an eviction notice for the garage apartment he'd been living in rent-free was worth every penny I'd spent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Patricia Hernandez, and I was 72 years old when my whole world shifted beneath my feet like the Texas clay after a summer storm. I had lived in the same modest ranch house in Plano, Texas for 43 years, ever since my late husband Roberto and I bought it as newlyweds in 1981. The house sat on Maple Street, a quiet residential road lined with mature oak trees that provided blessed shade during those scorching Texas summers when the temperature could hit 105 degrees for weeks on end. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over the decades. What once was a community of young families just starting out had evolved into a mix of original residents who had aged in place and newcomers attracted by the excellent school district and reasonable property values. Most of the houses had been updated and expanded, their values steadily climbing as the Dallas Metroplex continued its relentless growth northward. My little 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with its original wood paneling and harvest gold kitchen, appliances looked increasingly dated among the renovated homes with their modern facades and manicured landscapes. I had worked for 35 years as a bookkeeper for a chain of auto parts stores throughout the Dallas area. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and Roberto always said I had a gift for numbers. I could spot a discrepancy in an invoice from across the room, and I managed the financial records for 6 different store locations with the kind of precision that kept auditors happy and owners sleeping soundly at night. When Roberto passed away from a heart attack 7 years ago, I retired quietly with a modest pension and his life insurance policy. The house was paid off, my needs were simple, and I thought I had everything figured out for my golden years. Roberto and I had only one child, our son Michael, who was now 45 years old and worked in sales for a medical device company. At least, that's what he called it when people asked. The truth was more complicated. Michael had a pattern of jumping from job to job, always convinced the next opportunity would be his big break, always certain that he was just one promotion, away from the success that seemed to elude him decade after decade. He had a talent for talking himself into positions he wasn't quite qualified for, and an even greater talent for explaining why each failure wasn't really his fault. After his 3rd divorce 2 years ago, Michael had moved into the converted garage apartment behind my house. It was supposed to be temporary, just until he got back on his feet financially. The space had originally been Roberto's workshop, but we had added insulation, a small bathroom, and a kitchenette years earlier when we briefly considered renting it out for extra income. Michael moved in with promises to pay rent once his commission check stabilized, but somehow those checks never quite materialized in the amounts he projected. I didn't mind at first. He was my son, and after losing Roberto, I actually appreciated having someone nearby. Michael could reach things on high shelves, help with yard work, and drive me to appointments when my arthritis flared up. But gradually, I began to notice changes in how he spoke to me, how he treated our arrangement, and how he presented our living situation to others. The first red flag should have been how he answered when neighbors asked about his living arrangements. Instead of saying he was staying with his mother temporarily, he would say he was managing the property or overseeing my mother's affairs. When Mrs. Chen from across the street mentioned that it was nice he was taking care of me, he would smile and nod as if he were some kind of caregiver rather than an unemployed middle-aged man living rent-free in his mother's backyard. Michael had developed an unfortunate habit of treating me like I was becoming senile rather than simply aging. He would speak loudly when there was nothing wrong with my hearing, explain simple concepts as if I couldn't understand them, and make decisions about household matters without consulting me. When I mentioned wanting to update the kitchen, he told me it would be too stressful at my age. When I suggested we hire someone to repair the fence, he said I was being taken advantage of by contractors who preyed on elderly women. Yet somehow, he never seemed to have the time or resources to handle these projects himself. The neighborhood dynamics had grown increasingly uncomfortable over time. Michael had a way of inserting himself into conversations and presenting himself as the head of household. When delivery drivers came to the door, he would often intercept them and sign for packages addressed to me. When neighbors stopped by to chat, he would hover and eventually take over the conversation, often steering it toward his various business ventures and investment ideas. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home and community. Michael would invite his friends over to use the pool without asking my permission, leaving me to clean up their beer bottles and cigarette butts. He would park his truck in the driveway in a way that blocked my car, forcing me to ask him to move it whenever I needed to go somewhere. When I pointed out these inconsiderations, he would laugh and say I was being too sensitive or that I should be grateful for the company. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon in March when the weather was perfect, and many of my neighbors were outside working in their yards. I had spent the morning tending to my flower beds, planting new petunias and marigolds to replace the winter damage when Mrs. Rodriguez from next door came over to compliment my gardening. We were chatting pleasantly about the mild winter we'd had when Michael emerged from the garage apartment with two of his friends, all of them carrying beer bottles despite it being barely past noon. The men were loud and boisterous, clearly having started their drinking early. Michael introduced his friends to Mrs. Rodriguez, describing himself as the man of the house and explaining how he was taking care of all the property maintenance and financial decisions. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment as he continued his performance, but I held my tongue out of respect for our neighbor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then one of his friends, a man I had never met before, made a comment about how nice it must be to have such a devoted son. Michael laughed and said something that will be burned into my memory forever. He said, "Well, somebody has to keep an eye on things around here. She's basically become a freeloader in her own house, if you know what I mean. Can't really handle adult responsibilities anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Rodriguez's face showed her shock and discomfort. Several other neighbors who had been within earshot stopped their yard work and turned to stare. I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life, standing there in my own front yard while my son reduced me to a burden, a helpless dependent who couldn't manage her own affairs. I excused myself and went inside, my hands shaking as I closed the door behind me. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Roberto and I had shared thousands of meals, where we had helped Michael with homework, where we had made plans and dreams for our future. The harvest gold formica surface blurred through my tears as the full weight of what had just happened settled over me. Michael had not just insulted me, he had humiliated me in front of people I had known for decades, people who had watched me raise a family, maintain a home, and contribute to this community for over 40 years. He had reduced my entire existence to that of a freeloader, someone who took without giving, someone who had become a burden rather than a person deserving of respect. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my house, really looking at it for the first time in months. I saw the fresh coat of paint I had applied to the living room the previous fall. I noticed the new bathroom fixtures I had installed after careful research and comparison shopping. I observed the spotless condition of every room, maintained through my daily cleaning routines. I thought about the mortgage payments I had made faithfully for over 2 decades, the property taxes I paid promptly every year, the utility bills that came addressed to me and were paid from my checking account. I was not a freeloader in my own home. I was the homeowner, the taxpayer, the person whose name was on the deed and every utility account. Michael was the one living without paying rent, without contributing to household expenses, without even maintaining the space he occupied. Yet somehow, in his mind and in his presentation to others, I had become the dependent one. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I got dressed in my best outfit, applied makeup carefully, and drove to the bank where I had maintained accounts since 1981. I asked to speak with a loan officer about my financial options. The young woman who met with me, Jessica, was probably close to Michael's age, but she treated me with respect and professionalism that had been missing from my interactions with my own son. Jessica pulled up my accounts and reviewed my financial history. What she showed me was surprising even to me. Between Roberto's life insurance payout, my pension, Social Security, and the modest investments we had maintained over the years, my financial position was much stronger than I had realized. The house was worth significantly more than we had paid for it, and my monthly expenses were relatively low since the mortgage was long since paid off. More importantly, Jessica explained that at my age, and with my credit history, I qualified for several different types of loans and financial products. I could access equity in my current home through a reverse mortgage if I wanted to stay put, or I could use my assets as a down payment for a new property if I wanted to relocate. The possibilities she outlined made my head spin, but they also ignited something in me that had been dormant for too long. I spent the rest of that week doing research. I drove through neighborhoods, looked at real estate websites, and called a realtor recommended by Mrs. Chen. I wasn't sure exactly what I was planning, but I knew I needed to explore my options. The realtor, Carmen Vasquez, was an energetic woman, in her 50s, who had been selling homes in Plano for over 20 years. When I explained my situation in general terms, she nodded knowingly and said she had helped other seniors navigate similar family dynamics. Carmen showed me several properties. Over the next 2 weeks, some were smaller condominiums that would require less maintenance. Others were houses in active adult communities with amenities and social activities. All of them were nice, but none of them felt right. They felt like retreats, like admissions of defeat, like places where I would go to quietly fade away rather than to reclaim my life. Then Carmen suggested something that hadn't occurred to me. She asked if I had ever considered staying in my current neighborhood but changing my living situation in a more dramatic way. When I asked what she meant, she pulled up a listing on her tablet that made my heart skip a beat. The house directly next door to mine, a beautiful 2-story brick home with 4 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, had just come on the market. The house belonged to the Morrison family, who had lived there for 15 years before deciding to relocate to Arizona for retirement. I had watched their children grow up, had attended graduation parties in their backyard, had borrowed cups of sugar and loaned garden tools over the fence that separated our properties. It was a lovely home, well-maintained and updated with modern amenities and about twice the square footage of my current house. More importantly, buying that house would allow me to stay in the neighborhood I loved while making a statement that couldn't be ignored or misinterpreted. I would go from being seen as a dependent freeloader to being the woman who owned 2 houses on the same street. The symbolism was impossible to miss, and the practical implications were even more significant. Carmen ran the numbers, and they worked better than I had dared to hope. Using my current house as collateral, I could secure a mortgage for the Morrison property with reasonable monthly payments. Even better, I could rent out my current house to generate income that would more than cover the mortgage on the new one. Michael would have to find new living arrangements, of course, but at 45 years old with no rent or financial responsibilities, he had certainly had enough time to plan for that possibility. The decision crystallized during another uncomfortable encounter with Michael and his friends the following weekend. They had gathered around my pool again, drinking beer and talking loudly about various get-rich-quick schemes. When I asked them to keep the noise down because it was early in the morning, Michael told his friends that I was getting cranky in my old age and didn't like fun anymore. The casual cruelty of it, the automatic dismissal of my legitimate request, confirmed everything I needed to know about how this living arrangement was working. I called Carmen that afternoon and made an offer on the Morrison house. It was accepted within 24 hours. The escrow process moved faster than I had anticipated, and suddenly I found myself juggling inspections, appraisals, and paperwork while trying to maintain the facade of normalcy around Michael. I didn't want him to know what I was planning until everything was finalized. Part of me worried he might try to interfere or create complications if he discovered my intentions too early. Another part of me simply wanted to savor the private satisfaction of having a plan, of moving forward with purpose, while he remained oblivious to the shift happening right under his nose. Carmen proved to be more than just a realtor during those weeks. She became something of a confidant and strategist, helping me navigate not just the financial aspects of the purchase but the emotional complexity of what I was undertaking. She had seen similar situations before, she told me, where family members had taken advantage of an elderly relative's generosity and then been shocked when that relative decided to reclaim their independence. The key, she explained, was to approach everything methodically and legally, ensuring that no one could later claim I had acted impulsively or without proper consideration. During the inspection period, I spent hours walking through the Morrison house with various professionals. The home inspector was a thorough man named David, who had been in the business for 25 years. He showed me every system, explained every potential issue, and praised the previous owners for their meticulous maintenance. The electrical panel was updated, the HVAC system was only 3 years old, and the roof had been replaced just 5 years earlier. The kitchen featured granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and custom cabinetry that made my harvest gold kitchen look like something from a museum. The master bedroom suite on the second floor was larger than my entire living room, with a walk-in closet that could hold more clothes than I had owned in my entire lifetime. The master bathroom had a soaking tub, a separate shower with multiple jets, and double vanities with beautiful lighting. Standing in that space, I tried to imagine myself getting ready each morning surrounded by such luxury, such spaciousness, such evidence of success and self-worth. The backyard was even more impressive than what I could see from my side of the fence. The Morrisons had installed a deck with built-in seating, professional landscaping with automatic irrigation, and a fire pit area that would be perfect for entertaining. The pool was larger than mine, with a spa attachment and updated equipment. That would be much more energy efficient than my aging system. While I explored my potential new home, life continued in its uncomfortable pattern next door. Michael's behavior seemed to be escalating, as if he sensed some shift in the dynamic, even though I hadn't told him anything specific. He became more controlling about household decisions, more dismissive of my opinions, and more proprietary about the space. When I mentioned that I was thinking about having the air conditioning system serviced before summer arrived, he told me he would handle it, and that I shouldn't worry about such technical matters. When I said I wanted to update my will, he suggested that such decisions should be made carefully, and perhaps with his input to ensure I didn't make any mistakes. The most troubling incident occurred when my neighbor Mrs. Chen came over to return a pie plate I had lent her the week before. She mentioned that her daughter was getting married in the fall and asked if she could possibly use my backyard for some of the wedding photos, since the mature trees and flower beds would provide a beautiful backdrop. Before I could respond, Michael appeared from the garage apartment and inserted himself into the conversation. He told Mrs. Chen that the backyard was getting a lot of use already, and that adding a photography session might be too much disruption for me to handle at my age. He suggested that she might want to consider professional venues that were better equipped for such events. I stood there feeling mortified as he essentially declined the request on my behalf, speaking about me as if I weren't present and capable of making my own decisions. After Mrs. Chen left, clearly confused and a bit hurt by the rejection, I confronted Michael about his behavior. I told him that I was perfectly capable of deciding whether to help a neighbor with wedding photos, and that he had no right to speak for me in such matters. His response was to pat my arm condescendingly and explain that he was just trying to protect me from taking on more than I could handle. He said that as I got older, I would need to learn to rely on his judgment more and trust that he had my best interests at heart. That conversation crystallized something for me. Michael wasn't just being thoughtless or occasionally overprotective. He was systematically undermining my autonomy and establishing himself as the decision-maker in my life. Whether he was doing it consciously or not, he was creating a narrative where I was becoming increasingly incapable, and he was becoming increasingly necessary. The trajectory was clear, and it led to a future where I would become a passenger in my own life, dependent on his approval for every significant choice. I began paying closer attention to how he spoke about me to others and how he positioned himself in our relationship. When the mail carrier commented that I kept beautiful flower beds, Michael responded that he had been helping me with the gardening since I wasn't able to handle the physical demands anymore. When the grocery delivery person complimented my organization of the order, Michael mentioned that he had been taking over more of the household management to reduce my stress. None of these statements were technically lies, but they created an impression that was fundamentally false. The financial closing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in late April. Carmen had arranged for us to meet at the title company at 3 o'clock, which would give me time to complete the transaction and return home before Michael typically finished his daily activities. I had been careful to schedule all my real estate-related appointments during times when he was out of the house, either at his sporadic work commitments or social activities with his friends. The night before closing, I lay awake thinking about what I was about to do. The magnitude of the decision wasn't lost on me. I was 72 years old, purchasing a home that cost more than I had ever imagined spending, taking on a mortgage payment for the first time in over 20 years, and fundamentally altering the trajectory of my life. But more than that, I was making a statement about who I was and what I was capable of. I was refusing to accept the diminished role that had been assigned to me. I thought about Roberto and what he would think of my decision. We had always been conservative with money, preferring security over risk, stability over adventure. But we had also believed in standing up for ourselves and not allowing others to take advantage of our kindness. Roberto had always supported my independence and decision-making abilities. I felt confident that he would understand what I was doing and why it was necessary. The closing process itself was surprisingly straightforward. Carmen had prepared me for every document I would need to sign, every question I might be asked, and every step of the procedure. The title company representative, a professional woman named Angela, treated me with respect and took time to explain anything I didn't understand. There was no suggestion that I was too old to be making such a purchase or that I should have a family member present to help me with the decision. When Angela handed me the keys to my new home, I felt a surge of emotion that caught me off guard. These weren't just keys to a house. They were keys to my freedom, my independence, my refusal to be diminished. I thanked everyone involved and walked out of that office as the owner of 2 properties, a woman of substance who had just made the largest financial transaction of her life entirely on her own terms. I drove directly to my new house and let myself in through the front door. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating hardwood floors that gleamed with recent refinishing. The space felt enormous after spending so many years in my smaller ranch house. I walked from room to room, running my hands along granite countertops, opening cabinet doors, testing light switches, claiming every inch of the space as mine. In IT, the master bedroom. I stood at the large window that overlooked both my old house and the street beyond. I could see Michael's truck parked in my driveway, could see the garage apartment where he was probably taking his afternoon nap or playing video games. From this vantage point, my old life looked smaller, more constrained, like something I was viewing from a great height, rather than something I was trapped within. I spent over an hour in that house, planning where I would put furniture, imagining how I would decorate each room, thinking about the dinner parties I might host and the overnight guests I could accommodate. The house represented possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider in years. It represented a future where I was the protagonist of my own story, rather than a supporting character in someone else's narrative. When I finally returned to my original house, Michael was sitting at my kitchen table eating a sandwich and scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up when I entered, merely grunting a greeting and continuing with his meal. I noticed that he had used the last of the bread and left the empty bag on the counter rather than throwing it away or adding it to the grocery list. Such small inconsiderations had become so routine that I barely registered them anymore. But today they felt symbolic of a larger pattern of taking without giving, of consuming without contributing. I began making mental lists of everything I would need to do to prepare for my transition to the new house. I would need to arrange for utilities to be transferred, decide which furniture to move and which to leave behind, coordinate with movers, and begin the process of preparing my current house for rental. Carmen had already provided me with contacts for property management companies that could handle the rental process and ongoing maintenance issues. More immediately, I needed to decide when and how to tell Michael about my purchase. The longer I waited, the more complicated the situation would become, but I wanted to have a clear plan in place before I revealed what I had done. I also wanted to savor these last few days of having this secret, of knowing that everything was about to change while he remained completely unaware. That evening, as we sat in the living room watching television, I found myself studying Michael with new eyes. At 45, he was still a reasonably attractive man, intelligent enough when he chose to apply himself, capable of being charming when it served his purposes. But he had also become comfortable with a lifestyle that required no real effort or responsibility on his part. He had grown accustomed to having his basic needs met without reciprocal obligations, to being catered to without having to consider anyone else's needs or preferences. I realized that my enabling had not been helping him become more independent or successful. If anything, it had allowed him to avoid the natural consequences of his choices and to postpone the kind of personal growth that only comes from genuine challenge and responsibility. By providing him with free housing, meals, and domestic services, I had created a situation where he had no incentive to change or improve his circumstances. The following Monday, I met with a property management company recommended by Carmen. The representative, Maria Santos, specialized in helping homeowners transition their primary residences into rental properties. She walked through my house, taking notes and photos, discussing the rental market in our area and the improvements that might maximize rental income. Maria explained that my house was well positioned for the rental market. The location was excellent, with good schools and convenient access to major employment centers. The house itself was structurally sound and well maintained, though she suggested some cosmetic updates that would allow me to charge premium rent, fresh paint throughout, updated light fixtures, and modernizing the kitchen and bathrooms would significantly increase the property's appeal to potential tenants. More importantly, Maria outlined the legal requirements for converting the property to a rental and removing the current occupant. Since Michael had never signed a lease agreement or established legal tenancy through regular rent payments, the situation was simpler than it might have been. However, she strongly recommended that I provide him with proper written notice and follow all state and local regulations to avoid any potential legal complications. We discussed timeline and logistics. Maria suggested that I give Michael 60 days' notice, which was more generous than legally required, but would demonstrate good faith and allow him adequate time to find alternative housing. During that period, I could complete the necessary updates to the house and prepare it for marketing to new tenants. She estimated that the rental income would be substantial enough to cover my new mortgage payment and provide additional monthly income. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and drafted a letter to Michael. I wanted to put everything in writing to ensure there could be no misunderstanding about timeline or expectations. The letter explained that I had purchased a new home and would be relocating within the next month. It informed him that the garage apartment would no longer be available for his use after 60 days from the date of the letter, and that he would need to make alternative living arrangements. I kept the tone professional, but not unkind. I didn't mention his behavior or the incidents that had motivated my decision. I simply presented the facts of the situation and the timeline he would need to follow. I also included information about local apartment complexes and resources that might help him find affordable housing. Writing that letter felt like drawing a line in the sand. Once I gave it to him, there would be no going back, no pretending that nothing had changed. Our relationship would enter a new phase, one where I was no longer willing to subsidize his lifestyle or accept his treatment of me as a dependent, rather than as his mother and the owner of the property where he lived. I sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it on the kitchen counter where he would be sure to see it. Then I sat in my living room and waited for him to come inside for dinner, knowing that everything was about to change and feeling more nervous and excited than I had felt in years. The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of activity that I hadn't experienced since Roberto and I first bought our house 43 years earlier. Every day seemed to bring new decisions, new challenges, and new discoveries about my own capabilities. I found myself energized in ways I hadn't felt in years, waking up each morning with a clear sense of purpose and a long list of tasks that needed my attention. Carmen had recommended a moving company that specialized in helping seniors transition between homes, and I scheduled a consultation with them for the following week. The representative who came to assess my belongings was a kind woman named Joyce, who had been helping families with relocations for over 15 years. She walked through every room of my house, taking notes about which items I wanted to move, which I wanted to donate, and which I planned to leave for the rental property. The process of deciding what to take and what to leave behind was more emotional than I had anticipated. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, every small household item carried memories of the life Roberto and I had built together. The dining room set where we had hosted Christmas dinners for decades. The recliner where he had watched football games on Sunday afternoons. The china cabinet filled with dishes we had received as wedding gifts and used for special occasions throughout our marriage. But there was also something liberating about starting fresh in a new space. I realized that I had been holding on to many things simply out of habit or obligation rather than genuine attachment. The spare bedroom had become a repository for items I never used but couldn't bring myself to discard. Closets were filled with clothes that no longer fit properly or reflected my current style preferences. Kitchen cabinets contained appliances and gadgets that had been replaced by newer versions but never disposed of. Joyce helped me think through the practical aspects of each decision. Which items would work well in the larger rooms of my new house? Which pieces were showing their age and might be worth replacing with something more current? Which belongings truly brought me joy versus those I was keeping only because they had always been there? We spent nearly 3 hours going through everything, and by the end of the consultation, I had a clear plan for the move. The essential furniture would come with me, along with my most treasured personal items and anything I used regularly. Everything else would either be donated to local charities or left in the house to make it more appealing to potential renters. While I was planning my move, Michael seemed to be in denial about the reality of his situation. Rather than actively searching for new housing or making concrete plans for his relocation, he spent most of his time complaining to anyone who would listen about my unreasonable decision. I overheard several phone conversations where he portrayed himself as the victim of an elderly mother's sudden irrational behavior. His narrative to friends and family members was that I was going through some kind of late-life crisis and making impulsive decisions that would ultimately harm both of us financially. He suggested that someone should intervene to prevent me from making a terrible mistake. What he didn't seem to understand was that my decision was neither impulsive nor irrational, but rather the result of careful planning and consideration of circumstances he had created through his own behavior. I received a phone call from my Sister Elena in San Antonio, who had apparently heard Michael's version of events. Elena was 3 years younger than me and had always been more impulsive and dramatic in her approach to life. She was calling to express her concern about my house purchase and to suggest that perhaps I should reconsider such a major decision at my age. Elena's call was frustrating because it revealed how effectively Michael had framed the situation to make himself appear sympathetic. He had apparently told her that I was being influenced by opportunistic real estate agents and making financial commitments I couldn't afford. He had painted a picture of confusion and poor judgment, rather than acknowledging the circumstances that had led to my decision. I spent over an hour on the phone with Elena, explaining the real dynamics of the situation and the careful planning that had gone into my home purchase. I shared details about my financial position that I hadn't discussed with anyone else, demonstrating that I was well within my means and had made a thoroughly informed decision. By the end of our conversation, Elena understood that I was not a confused elderly woman being taken advantage of, but rather someone who had taken control of an unsatisfactory situation. The experience with Elena made me realize how important it would be to control the narrative about my move. Michael was already working to present himself as the responsible party trying to protect an incompetent mother from her own poor judgment. I needed to ensure that neighbors, friends, and family members understood the real reasons for my decision and the careful planning that had made it possible. I decided to host a small gathering at my new house before I officially moved in. I invited several neighbors, including Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Rodriguez, and Mr. Johnson, along with a few other friends from the community. The purpose was to show them my new home, explain my excitement about the move, and demonstrate that I was making a positive choice rather than fleeing from problems. The gathering was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, and I spent considerable time preparing for it. I arranged for light refreshments and flowers to make the empty house feel more welcoming. I prepared talking points about my plans for decorating and landscaping. Most importantly, I wanted to present myself as confident and forward-looking rather than defensive about my decision. When my guests arrived, their reactions exceeded my expectations. Mrs. Chen was amazed by the spaciousness and modern amenities of the house. Mrs. Rodriguez complimented the beautiful kitchen and asked about my plans for entertaining in the larger dining room. Mr. Johnson was impressed by the quality of construction and the energy-efficient features that would keep utility costs manageable. As we toured the house together, I found myself seeing it through their eyes and appreciating details I had taken for granted during my previous visits. The large windows that filled every room with natural light, the hardwood floors that gleamed with recent refinishing. The master suite that would give me a private retreat unlike anything I had experienced in my smaller house. But more than their admiration for the house itself, what struck me was their respect for my decision-making process. These were people who had known me for years, who had watched me manage my household, maintain my property, and handle my finances responsibly. They saw my home purchase as a natural extension of the competence I had always demonstrated, rather than as evidence of declining judgment. Mrs. Chen mentioned that she wished she had the courage to make such a significant change at her age. Mrs. Rodriguez said she admired my willingness to try something new rather than simply accepting the status quo. Mr. Johnson commented that it was inspiring to see someone embrace new possibilities rather than retreating into limitations. Their responses reinforced my confidence in what I was doing and helped me see the broader significance of my decision. I wasn't just solving a problem with Michael or upgrading my living situation. I was demonstrating that aging didn't have to mean accepting diminished expectations or reduced autonomy. I was showing that it was possible to take control of circumstances and create positive change regardless of age or family dynamics. During the gathering, several neighbors asked about my plans for my original house. When I explained that I would be renting it out as an investment property, they seemed impressed by the business acumen involved in my overall strategy. Rather than seeing me as someone making an emotional or impulsive decision, they recognized that I had created a plan that would improve my financial position while solving my living situation. The conversation inevitably turned to Michael and his reaction to my plans. I was careful to present the situation factually without speaking negatively about him personally. I explained that he was an adult who needed to establish his own independent living arrangement, and that the timing worked well for both of us to make positive changes in our lives. What I didn't say, but what some of my neighbors clearly understood, was that my decision had been motivated by a need to establish boundaries and reclaim my autonomy. Mrs. Rodriguez, in particular, seemed to recognize the family dynamics involved, mentioning that she had observed interactions between Michael and me that had concerned her. After my guests left, I stood alone in my new house feeling more certain than ever that I had made the right decision. The afternoon had demonstrated that my community supported my choice and respected my judgment. I was not isolated or acting against the advice of people who cared about me. Instead, I was surrounded by neighbors who appreciated my independence and admired my willingness to take control of my circumstances. The following week brought the beginning of renovations to my original house. Maria from the property management company had recommended several contractors who specialized in preparing homes for the rental market. The work would include fresh paint throughout, updated light fixtures, refinishing the hardwood floors, and modernizing both bathrooms and the kitchen. I decided to splurge on the kitchen renovation, finally replacing the Harvest Gold appliances and Formica countertops that had been showing their age for years. The new design featured white cabinets, granite countertops, and stainless steel, appliances that would appeal to contemporary renters, while also satisfying my own desire to see the space updated. Watching the transformation of my old kitchen was both satisfying and symbolic. For decades, I had cooked meals in that space using appliances that worked adequately, but reflected the style preferences of an earlier era. Now I was creating something current and beautiful, investing in improvements that would benefit both future tenants and my own financial returns. The renovation process required me to make dozens of decisions about colors, materials, fixtures, and finishes. Each choice reinforced my sense of agency and competence. I researched options, compared prices, consulted with contractors, and made selections based on my own preferences and practical considerations. No one questioned my judgment or suggested that I needed assistance with these decisions. Michael watched the renovation activity with obvious confusion and growing anxiety. The reality of permanent change was becoming impossible for him to ignore. Workers arrived each morning, construction noise filled the air, and the familiar spaces of his childhood home were being transformed into something designed for strangers rather than family. He made several attempts during this period to negotiate or delay the timeline for his move. He suggested that perhaps he could stay in the garage apartment even after I rented out the main house, serving as a caretaker or groundskeeper for the property. When I explained that the garage apartment was included in the rental agreement and that professional property management would handle any caretaking needs, he proposed paying rent for the space at below-market rates. Each of these proposals revealed his continuing inability to understand that our living arrangement was ending permanently rather than simply being modified or temporarily disrupted. He seemed to believe that if he could find the right compromise or arrangement, he could maintain his current lifestyle with minimal changes or increased responsibilities. I responded to these suggestions patiently but firmly. The decisions had been made, the timeline was established, and the arrangements were final. He was welcome to discuss practical logistics or ask for assistance with his moving plans, but the fundamental aspects of the situation were not open for negotiation. During this same period, I was busy preparing for my own move and settling into the rhythm of homeownership at my new address. I had utilities transferred, changed my address with banks and other institutions, and begun the process of personalizing the space. I ordered new bedroom furniture that would take advantage of the larger master suite, selected paint colors for the rooms I wanted to update, and planned improvements to the landscaping. The most significant purchase was a new dining room set that could accommodate 8 people comfortably. My old table seated 4, which had been adequate for Roberto, Michael, and me, but had always felt cramped when we hosted extended family or friends. The new table opened up possibilities for entertaining that I hadn't been able to consider in my smaller house. I also invested in a home security system and updated locks throughout the house. While the neighborhood was safe and crime was not a significant concern, I wanted the peace of mind that comes with knowing my new home was properly protected. More symbolically, these changes represented my complete ownership and control of the space. As my moving date approached, I began spending more time at the new house, bringing over small items and beginning to arrange furniture in preparation for the major move. Each visit reinforced my excitement about the change and my satisfaction with the decision I had made. The house felt more like home with each passing day. I established routines for my morning coffee in the bright breakfast nook. I planned where I would place my favorite reading chair to take advantage of the afternoon light in the living room. I imagined hosting holiday dinners in the spacious dining room and overnight guests in the comfortable spare bedrooms. Perhaps, most importantly, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment every time I walked through the front door. This was my house, purchased with my money, reflecting my choices and preferences. No one had questioned my right to be there or suggested that I was incapable of managing the responsibilities of homeownership. I was not a freeloader or a dependent. I was a woman of means who had made a substantial investment in her own future and happiness. The transformation was not just about changing my living situation. It was about reclaiming my identity as a capable, independent person who deserved respect and consideration. Every decision I made, every contractor I hired, every improvement I planned reinforced my sense of agency and competence. I was no longer someone who accepted whatever circumstances others created for me. I was someone who identified problems, developed solutions, and took action to improve my situation. The woman who had stood silently while being humiliated in her own front yard was becoming someone who commanded respect through her actions, rather than hoping for consideration through her patience. Moving day arrived with the kind of oppressive Texas heat that makes the air shimmer like water above hot pavement. By 7 in the morning, the temperature was already climbing toward what the weather forecast promised would be another scorching day over 95 degrees. I had arranged for Michael's moving truck to arrive first, at 8 o'clock, followed by my own movers at 10. The timing would allow his departure to be completed before my final transition began, creating a clean break between the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a crisp white blouse and navy slacks that projected competence and composure. I wanted to look like someone in control of the situation rather than someone being overwhelmed by circumstances. My hair was styled, my makeup applied with the same attention I had given to important occasions throughout my life. This was an important occasion, perhaps one of the most significant days I had experienced since Roberto's funeral. Michael was already awake when I emerged from the house, loading boxes into his truck with mechanical efficiency but obvious reluctance. His movements were sharp and angry, the physical manifestation of resentment he had been expressing in various ways throughout the previous weeks. He had recruited 2 friends to help with the heavier items, and they worked mostly in silence, communicating through nods and gestures rather than conversation. I offered coffee to the moving crew, both Michael's helpers and the professionals, who would be arriving later. It seemed like the appropriate thing to do, a gesture of courtesy that acknowledged the physical demands of their work without suggesting any emotional investment in the outcome. Michael declined my offer with barely concealed irritation, but his friends accepted gratefully, commenting on the heat and the early start to their day. As the morning progressed, I positioned myself on the front porch of my new house, where I could observe the activities while maintaining some emotional distance from the process. From this vantage point, I could see both properties clearly and monitor the progress being made on each side of the fence that had once seemed so insignificant, but now represented a profound boundary between my past and future. The symbolism of the day was not lost on me. Michael was packing up his life in boxes and bags, removing all traces of his occupancy from the garage apartment that had sheltered him for 2 years. At the same time, I was preparing to complete my own transition into a home that represented independence, financial capability, and refusal to accept diminished expectations. Neighbors began emerging from their houses as the activity increased, drawn by curiosity about the unusual level of commotion on our typically quiet street. Mrs. Chen waved from her garden, where she was watering flowers in an apparent attempt to keep them alive through another brutal Texas summer. Mr. Johnson paused during his morning jog to observe the moving trucks and workers, clearly trying to piece together exactly what was happening. Mrs. Rodriguez approached from her house next door, concern evident on her face as she surveyed the scene. She had always been the most socially aware of my immediate neighbors, the one most likely to know everyone's business and to offer help during times of transition or difficulty. I invited her to join me on the porch, and she accepted a glass of iced tea while we watched the morning's activities together. She asked directly what was happening, and I explained the situation straightforwardly. Michael was moving to his own apartment, and I was relocating to the house next door. The renovated property would become a rental investment. Everything was proceeding according to plan, and I was excited about the changes taking place. Mrs. Rodriguez listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about my decision-making process and my satisfaction with how things were progressing. Her tone was supportive rather than judgmental, and she seemed to understand the complexity of family relationships that had led to this dramatic restructuring of living arrangements. What struck me most about our conversation was her obvious respect for my decision-making capabilities. She didn't suggest that I might be making a mistake or question whether I had considered all the implications of my choices. Instead, she complimented my courage in making such significant changes and expressed admiration for my business acumen in converting my former home into rental property. As we talked, other neighbors gradually joined our impromptu gathering on the porch. Word was spreading through the community about the unusual events taking place, and people were curious about the details. Rather than feeling exposed or defensive about the attention, I found myself enjoying the opportunity to share my story and explain my decisions to people who had known me for years. The response from my neighbors was overwhelmingly positive and supportive. Several people mentioned that they had been impressed by the renovations to my original house and thought it would make an excellent rental property. Others expressed admiration for my willingness to embrace change, rather than simply accepting the status quo. A few shared their own stories of major life transitions they had made in their later years. Mr. Johnson, the retiree who lived 3 houses down, was particularly encouraging. He had recently downsized from a larger home to a smaller one and understood the emotional complexity of major housing changes. He talked about the liberation he had felt in simplifying his living situation and focusing on what truly mattered to him in this stage of life. What became clear through these conversations was that my neighbors saw me as someone making positive, proactive choices, rather than someone being forced into unwelcome changes by circumstances beyond my control. They recognized my agency and competence rather than viewing me as a victim of family dysfunction or age-related limitations. Around 10 o'clock, my own moving crew arrived in a large truck with the name of a reputable local company emblazoned on the sides. The team leader, a professional woman named Sandra who managed logistics for senior relocations, introduced herself and her crew before beginning their assessment of the work to be completed. I had prepared detailed lists and labels for everything being moved, and Sandra complimented my organization and preparation. The efficiency of the professional movers was impressive compared to the somewhat chaotic approach Michael and his friends had taken. Every item was handled carefully, wrapped appropriately, and loaded systematically to ensure safe transport and easy unloading. Sandra coordinated the efforts of her team while keeping me informed about timing and any questions that arose. Watching my belongings being transferred from one house to another was surreal. Furniture that had occupied the same positions for decades was suddenly mobile, traveling the short distance from my old front door to my new one. The dining room table where Roberto and I had shared thousands of meals was carried across the yard to a more spacious room where it would serve new purposes and create new memories. Michael's departure occurred with minimal ceremony or emotional acknowledgement. By 11:30, his truck was loaded and his friends were ready to follow him to his new apartment. He approached me as I stood supervising the placement of furniture in my new living room, clearly struggling with how to handle this transition moment. His goodbye was awkward and brief, consisting of a stiff hug and a promise to call once he was settled. There was no apology for the behavior that had precipitated this change, no acknowledgement of the circumstances that had made such dramatic action necessary. But there was also no further argument or attempt to negotiate a different outcome. He seemed to have accepted the finality of what was happening, even if he didn't approve of it. I watched from my new front window as his truck pulled out of the driveway and headed down Maple Street toward his independent future. The relief I felt was immediate and profound. The weight of constant tension, of walking on eggshells in my own home, of having my capabilities and judgment questioned daily, lifted from my shoulders like a physical burden being removed. The afternoon was devoted to settling into my new space and making it feel like home rather than simply a house, filled with familiar furniture. Sandra and her team were meticulous about placing items where I directed, but the real work of creating a living space that reflected my personality and preferences would take time and careful consideration. I started with the master bedroom, arranging furniture to take advantage of the natural light and views of the neighborhood. The room was large enough to accommodate a sitting area near the windows, something I had never been able to create in my smaller house. I positioned my favorite reading chair where I could look out at the street and watch the daily rhythms of community life. The kitchen required the most adjustment, since the layout and storage options were completely different from what I had used for over 4 decades. But the modern appliances and abundant counter space offered possibilities for cooking and entertaining that I hadn't been able to consider in my old kitchen. I spent time organizing cabinets and drawers, creating systems that would make meal preparation more efficient and enjoyable. By late afternoon, the basic furniture placement was complete, and the moving crew had departed with my thanks and a generous tip for their excellent service. I stood in my new living room, surrounded by boxes yet to be unpacked and rooms yet to be fully organized, but feeling more at home than I had felt in years. The silence in the house was different from the oppressive quiet that had characterized my life with Michael nearby. This was peaceful silence, contemplative silence, the kind that comes from being completely comfortable in your own space without the need to monitor someone else's moods or anticipate someone else's demands. I made dinner for myself in my new kitchen, a simple meal of grilled chicken and vegetables that I ate at my dining room table while watching the sunset through the large windows. The experience felt ceremonial, like a formal inauguration of my new life, rather than just another ordinary evening meal. As darkness fell, I walked through each room of my house, turning on lights and familiarizing myself with the sounds and rhythms of my new environment. The house settled differently than my old one, with different creaks and sighs as the temperature cooled. But these were comfortable sounds, the sounds of a home that belonged entirely to me. I ended the evening on my new back deck, sitting in a chair I had positioned to take advantage of the view of my landscaped yard and the houses beyond. The neighborhood looked different from this perspective, more expansive and full of possibility. I could see lights in windows where families were spending their evenings, hear the distant sounds of children playing and adults conversing. But I wasn't nostalgic for family life or feeling lonely in my solitude. Instead, I felt peaceful and accomplished, like someone who had successfully navigated a difficult transition and emerged stronger on the other side. I had identified a problem, developed a solution, and executed a plan that had fundamentally improved my circumstances and prospects. The next morning brought a phone call that would crystallize everything I had been feeling about my new situation. Carmen called to inform me that a couple had submitted an application to rent my renovated house, along with first month's rent, last month's rent, and security deposit. They were young professionals who worked in the medical field, had excellent credit and references, and were looking for a long-term rental arrangement. The efficiency with which this final piece fell into place felt almost magical. In less than 24 hours, I had transitioned from being someone whose living situation was complicated by an unwelcome family member to being someone whose real estate investment was generating immediate income. The financial projections that had seemed theoretical during my planning phase were now concrete reality. I scheduled a meeting with the prospective tenants for the following day, wanting to meet them in person and ensure they would be respectful occupants of the property I had put so much effort into improving. Maria from the property management company would handle the legal aspects of the lease agreement, but I wanted to maintain personal involvement in selecting the people who would be living in my former home. The couple, David and Jennifer, were in their early 30s and worked at different hospitals in the Dallas area. They were impressed by the quality of the renovations and the attention to detail evident throughout the house. Jennifer particularly admired the updated kitchen, while David appreciated the garage workspace and storage options. They seemed like the kind of tenants who would maintain the property carefully and respect the investment I had made in its improvement. As I walked through the house with them, pointing out features and explaining systems, I felt a profound sense of pride in what I had accomplished. This wasn't just a rental transaction. It was evidence of my capability, my judgment, and my ability to create value through careful planning and execution. The rental income would more than cover my mortgage payments on the new house, leaving me with additional monthly income and significant equity in both properties. I had not only solved the problem of Michael's disrespectful behavior, but had also improved my financial position and created new opportunities for future growth. That evening, I called Elena to update her on how everything had turned out. Her tone was completely different from our conversation weeks earlier, when she had been concerned about my decision-making capabilities. Now, she was congratulating me on my business acumen and expressing admiration for how successfully I had managed such a complex transition. Elena mentioned that she had spoken with Michael, who had described his new apartment as adequate but expensive. He was apparently struggling with the reality of paying rent, utilities, and other expenses that had been covered by our previous arrangement. But he was also beginning to take responsibility for his own household management and daily routines. I felt no satisfaction in his difficulties, but I also felt no obligation to rescue him from the natural consequences of independence. At 45 years old, learning to manage his own living expenses and domestic responsibilities was long overdue. The challenges he was experiencing were normal parts of adult life that most people navigate successfully. The conversation with Elena confirmed that my family members now saw me as someone who had made smart, strategic decisions rather than someone who had acted impulsively or irrationally. The results spoke for themselves, and the financial and personal benefits of my choices were undeniable. As I prepared for bed in my new master bedroom, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just a few months. I had gone from feeling diminished and disrespected in my own home to feeling empowered and accomplished in a space that reflected my values and capabilities. I had transformed a problem into an opportunity and emerged from a difficult situation stronger and more independent than before. The woman who had stood silently while being called a freeloader in front of her neighbors was gone, replaced by someone who commanded respect through her actions rather than hoping for consideration through her patience. I had not just bought a house. I had bought my dignity, my autonomy, and my future. 6 months later, I was hosting my first Thanksgiving dinner in my new home, and the dining room that had once seemed impossibly large was filled with the warm voices of family and friends who had come to celebrate with me. Elena had driven up from San Antonio with her husband Carlos, bringing homemade tamales that had become a tradition at our holiday gatherings. Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Rodriguez had accepted my invitation to join us, along with Dorothy from my real estate investment group and 2 other neighbors who had become genuine friends rather than mere acquaintances. The table was set with my grandmother's china, which looked magnificent against the rich mahogany of my new dining set. The chandelier I had selected cast a warm glow over the faces gathered around me, and the spacious kitchen had made preparing the meal a pleasure rather than a stressful juggling act. Everything about the evening reflected the life I had chosen to create for myself. Michael had been invited, of course, and had initially accepted before calling the night before to cancel, claiming a conflict with friends' plans. I suspected his real motivation was discomfort with the changed dynamic between us and uncertainty about how to navigate our relationship in this new context. I felt neither hurt nor surprised by his absence, simply noting it as another indication that he was still adjusting to the reality of our revised arrangement. The conversation during dinner naturally turned to the changes that had taken place over the past year. Dorothy shared updates about her latest property acquisition, a duplex that would provide steady rental income while requiring minimal maintenance. Mrs. Chen talked about her decision to finally take the European river cruise. She had been planning for years, inspired by my example of making bold choices rather than accepting limitations. Elena raised her glass in a toast to my courage and business success, mentioning that my rental property was now generating enough income to cover both my mortgage and provide substantial monthly surplus. The young couple renting my former home had proven to be ideal tenants, maintaining the property immaculately and even improving the landscaping with my permission. What struck me most about the evening was how natural it felt to be hosting such a gathering, to be seen as someone worth celebrating rather than someone who needed caretaking. The conversations flowed easily, touching on topics ranging from travel plans and investment strategies to community events and shared interests. I was a full participant rather than a passive observer, contributing insights and opinions that were valued and respected. After dinner, we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, where the conversation became more personal. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that she had been inspired by my example to have a difficult conversation with her own adult daughter about boundaries and respect. Dorothy talked about how age had given her permission to prioritize her own happiness rather than constantly accommodating other people's expectations. Elena shared that watching my transformation had motivated her to make changes in her own life, including pursuing art classes she had always wanted to take and setting firmer limits with family members who had been taking advantage of her generosity. The ripple effects of my decision to reclaim my autonomy had apparently extended far beyond my own circumstances. As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, each person made a point of thanking me not just for the meal, but for the inspiration my story had provided. Mrs. Chen hugged me warmly and said that knowing me had given her courage to make her own bold choices. Dorothy mentioned that my success had convinced her to expand her real estate investments rather than playing it safe. After everyone had departed and I was cleaning up in my beautiful kitchen, I reflected on how profoundly my life had changed since that humiliating day when Michael had called me a freeloader in front of our neighbors. The woman who had stood silent and diminished in her own front yard had been replaced by someone who hosted dinner parties, managed investment properties, and inspired others to pursue their own independence. The financial transformation had been just as dramatic as the personal one. The rental income from my former home was providing security and freedom I had never experienced before. I had been able to take the European cruise Mrs. Chen had mentioned, traveling to places Roberto and I had always dreamed of visiting together. I had updated my wardrobe, invested in home improvements, and even purchased a newer car that reflected my improved circumstances. But beyond the material benefits, the psychological change had been the most significant. I woke up each morning in a home that belonged entirely to me, surrounded by choices I had made and environments I had created. I no longer monitored anyone else's moods or adjusted my behavior to accommodate someone else's preferences. My time was my own, my decisions were my own, and my future was shaped by my own priorities rather than other people's expectations. The relationship with Michael had evolved into something more appropriate for adults, though it remained somewhat distant and formal. He visited occasionally, usually around holidays or special occasions, and our interactions were polite but careful. He had never explicitly apologized for the behavior that precipitated my dramatic response, but his demeanor suggested that he understood the connection between his actions and their consequences. His own life had stabilized in some ways and remained chaotic in others. He was working more consistently, having apparently realized that paying rent and utilities required steady income rather than sporadic commission checks. But he continued to struggle with the practical aspects of independent living and had called me several times seeking advice about everything from insurance policies to home repairs. I had helped when asked, but always as a consultant rather than a caretaker, providing information and suggestions without taking responsibility for implementing solutions. The dynamic between us was more balanced now, based on mutual respect rather than assumed dependency. He could no longer take my assistance for granted or treat my home as his personal resource. The success of my rental property had led to conversations with Dorothy about additional real estate investments. We had looked at several properties together, and I was seriously considering purchasing a small apartment building that would provide even greater returns while diversifying my portfolio. The woman who had once worried about having enough money for retirement was now planning strategies for building wealth. My social life had expanded beyond anything I had experienced since Roberto's death. The real estate investment group met monthly, and I had become one of the more active participants, sharing insights from my bookkeeping background and learning from others' experiences with different types of properties. I had also joined a book club that met at the local library and a gardening society that organized seasonal flower shows. These activities connected me with people who shared my interests and saw me as a peer rather than someone's elderly relative. The conversations were stimulating and forward-looking, focused on future plans and current projects rather than past accomplishments or health concerns. I felt intellectually engaged and socially connected in ways that had been missing from my life for years. The neighborhood dynamics had also shifted in my favor. Word had spread about my successful transition from homeowner to property investor, and other residents now sought my advice about real estate matters and financial planning. I had become someone known for competence and good judgment rather than someone who needed looking after. Mrs. Rodriguez had introduced me to her daughter, a young professional who was considering buying her first home, and I had been able to provide guidance about the mortgage process and property evaluation. Mr. Johnson had consulted me about refinancing options for his own home. Even the mail carrier had asked for recommendations about local contractors after seeing the quality of work done on my rental property. On a crisp December evening, almost exactly 1 year after I had first met with Carmen about purchasing the Morrison house, I sat on my back deck with a cup of tea and watched lights come on in windows throughout the neighborhood. The air was cool but not uncomfortably cold, typical of Texas winters that allow for outdoor reflection even in the final weeks of the year. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the series of decisions and actions that had transformed my circumstances so completely. The house purchase that had seemed so daunting initially now felt like the natural first step in a larger process of reclaiming my life and creating new possibilities for my future. The eviction notice I had served to Michael, which had felt so harsh and dramatic at the time, now seemed like a necessary boundary that had benefited both of us. He was learning to be truly independent for the first time in his adult life, while I had recovered my autonomy and self-respect. Our relationship was healthier, even if it was more distant, because it was based on choice rather than obligation. As I prepared for bed in my master bedroom, I looked out the window at my former home, where warm light glowed from the windows, and my tenants were presumably settling in for the evening. The house looked well-maintained and welcoming, evidence that my investment in renovations had been wise and that I had chosen good tenants who respected the property. The sight filled me with satisfaction rather than nostalgia. That house represented my past, but it was also contributing to my present security and future possibilities. I had transformed a difficult family situation into a financial opportunity while creating the independence and respect I deserved. The woman who had been called a freeloader in front of her neighbors now owned 2 properties, generated rental income, and commanded respect in her community. I had not just bought a house next door. I had bought my dignity, my future, and my right to be seen as the capable, independent person I had always been, but had temporarily forgotten how to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.